Before we begin, if you enjoy long-form wrestling history like this, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments what wrestling territory or era you'd like to see covered next. Professional wrestling has always existed in a strange space between sport and theater. It is staged, but when done right, it feels real. It feels emotional. It feels personal. For much of wrestling history, that balance wasn't perfected on global television, but in regional territories scattered across the United States. Each territory had its own style, its own identity, its own rules. And among all of them, one territory earned a reputation that still echoes decades later: Florida Championship Wrestling. To some, it was the most realistic wrestling in the world. To others, it was the greatest promo school ever created. To many wrestlers, it was the place where you learned how to think about wrestling. Florida was not built on spectacle. It was built on psychology, believability, and emotional investment. This is the story of how Florida Championship Wrestling rose, thrived, shaped generations, and ultimately fell, leaving behind one of the most important legacies in professional wrestling history. Long before championship wrestling from Florida became a household name, wrestling in the state was fragmented and informal. In the 1930s and 1940s, Florida was still developing. Tourism was growing. Military bases brought transient crowds looking for entertainment. Wrestling promoters saw opportunity. Matches were held in armories, fairgrounds, and small arenas. Wrestlers traveled constantly, often living out of their cars. The business was rough, unregulated, and fiercely territorial. By the late 1940s, Tampa emerged as a central hub. Tampa had strong crowds, reliable attendance, and a geographic advantage, allowing promoters to loop talent efficiently through the state. That made Florida valuable. It also made it competitive. Control of the territory shifted hands multiple times until a quiet, intelligent wrestler named Eddie Graham began positioning himself not just as talent, but as a leader. Eddie Graham, born Edward Gossett, was unlike most wrestling promoters. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flamboyant. He wasn't obsessed with gimmicks. He was a thinker. Graham believed wrestling worked best when fans forgot they were watching a performance. He believed the audience should emotionally identify with wrestlers, not just cheer or boo them. Under Eddie Graham, Florida became a classroom. Young wrestlers didn't just learn moves, they learned timing, crowd control, facial expression, body language. Graham famously told wrestlers that promos should sound like one man talking to another, not a performer yelling at a camera. Florida exposed wrestlers who didn't understand why they were doing something. And for those willing to learn, Eddie Graham became something rare in wrestling: a mentor. By the early 1960s, championship wrestling from Florida was firmly established as an NWA territory. Television was the engine. Every Saturday morning, championship wrestling from Florida aired from WTSP Channel 10 in Tampa, later expanding to WTVT Channel 13. The presentation was bare bones. The studio was small. The lighting was flat. The cameras rarely moved. Matches were often taped at the Fort Homer W. Hesterly Armory in Tampa. This wasn't television designed to impress. It was television designed to convince. Florida treated its audience like adults. And audiences responded. Jack Briscoe was Florida wrestling made flesh. An NCAA Division I amateur wrestling champion, Briscoe didn't need exaggeration. Eddie Graham presented him not as unbeatable, but as believable. His matches were methodical. His promos were quiet. His credibility was unquestioned. Between 1971 and 1974, Jack Briscoe's rivalry with Dory Funk Jr. defined Florida wrestling. Their matches, often 60-minute draws in Tampa and Miami, weren't built on hatred. They were built on respect. When matches ended without a winner, fans didn't feel cheated. They felt convinced. And alongside Jack was Gerald Briscoe, a quieter presence, but foundational. Gerald learned how to structure matches, protect opponents, and preserve credibility. Together, the Briscoe brothers represented Florida's highest value: respect for the audience's intelligence. Dory Funk Jr. fit Florida naturally. He carried the NWA World Heavyweight Championship like a responsibility. There was no irony in Dory Funk. Terry Funk was different. In Florida during the mid-1970s, Terry was intense but controlled. His feud with Jack Briscoe in 1975 was built on gradual emotional erosion. A glare held too long, a shove that lingered, a referee argument that crossed the line. Eddie Graham didn't tell Terry Funk to calm down. He told him to focus. Florida taught Terry Funk how to turn emotion into narrative. And when Terry finally exploded, it meant something. Dusty Rhodes did not look like a champion. He didn't sound polished. He didn't fit the mold. But Eddie Graham saw authenticity. Dusty's early Florida feud with superstar Billy Graham told a simple story: a perfect-looking champion versus a man who looked like the audience. Later, Dusty's rivalry with the masked superstar, Bill Eadie, in the mid-1970s turned Dusty into something more. Matches at the Miami Beach Convention Center and Tampa Armory ended in chaos driven by emotion, not weapons. Dusty's promos rambled. He repeated himself. He spoke from feeling, not polish. Florida allowed that, and fans believed him. Florida didn't create Dusty Rhodes. Florida allowed Dusty Rhodes to exist. By the 1970s, Florida was one of the strongest territories in America. Television ratings were high. Live events were profitable. Talent flowed constantly. Florida became a proving ground. Ric Flair learned promo pacing. Hulk Hogan learned timing and restraint. Harley Race refined his menace by doing less. Florida didn't create cartoon stars. It created professionals. But something subtle had begun to change. The stars Florida shaped were no longer staying. They were being exported. And at the center of it all was a man quietly running out of strength. Eddie Graham wasn't just booking wrestling. He was protecting a philosophy. Every finish mattered. Every promo mattered. Every wrestler had to understand why Florida worked. By the early 1980s, wrestling was changing. Cable television demanded louder characters. National expansion demanded spectacle. At the same time, Graham's health and personal life were deteriorating. On January 21, 1985, Eddie Graham died by suicide at his home in Tampa. He was 65 years old. Florida didn't immediately fail. It lost its identity because Eddie Graham hadn't built a system. He had built himself into the system. Florida tried to continue. Others stepped in. Shows were still booked. Championships were still defended. But in a wrestling world racing toward national spectacle, Florida's quiet intelligence had no advocate left. As Vince McMahon expanded nationally, territories collapsed. Florida followed. Quietly. Florida Championship Wrestling didn't win a ratings war. It didn't become a global brand. But it taught wrestling how to feel real. When a wrestler pauses instead of rushing, when a promo sounds like a conversation, when a story unfolds slowly, that is Florida. And at the center of that philosophy was Eddie Graham. He believed wrestling should look like two people trying to win, not two performers trying to impress. Those ideas didn't disappear. They were carried forward. Florida Championship Wrestling is remembered not because it was loud, but because it was honest. And as long as wrestling values honesty, Eddie Graham's work endures. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like the video, subscribe for more deep dive wrestling history, and leave a comment below with what you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching.